Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our Department of Medicine lecture series. Today, I think we'll have a very different but interesting set of series of two sets of lectures from very interesting speakers and my men in terms of the department they hold. It will be Mrs. Seema Rao and Mrs. Divya Vasu, both from the legal office of our directorate session, CMC Fellow. So we thought even for our medical faculty, I think we need to be oriented in terms of having how to deal with patients in terms of medical legal cases, and also in terms of informed consent, telemedicine part. So they have agreed to us to taking these lectures for our sake. For the first session, it will be by Mrs. Seema Rao. Ma'am has had her degrees in Bachelor's in Law, Master's in Law in International Trade Law and Arbitration, and Master's in Business Law. She has been previously practicing in the Supreme Court of India and Delhi High Court in Civil Litigation. From 2012 to 2014, was representing Government of India in the Supreme Court as well as Minister of Environment and Forest before the National Green Tribunal. She has joined CMC in 2019. She is also wife of Dr. Atif, who is a professor in the Department of Neurology. Thank you, ma'am, once again for agreeing to take this lecture for us. She will be talking on telemedicine and informed consent, followed by Mrs. Divya Vasiva. Thanks, and over to you, ma'am, for the next session.
Thanks, Dr. I'll share my screen.
Sure.
Is this visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for having us. We'll try not to bore you with some legal aspects because it tend to be quite boring. So I will start with basic regulations of telemedicine in India. This is very important to understand because of now the advent of electronic technology and electronic medium, there is a high growth of consultations during by way of telecommunication. And now last year, because of COVID, it has now been recognized as a valid legal mode of patient consultation. So before looking into guidelines, I will briefly give a history of how telemedicine came into being in India. So actually, this telemedicine is not a new concept. It started in the year 2001 with a pilot project by ISRO. ISRO did a project with Apollo hospitals, and they connected a lot of rural hospitals in Chittoor district in Andhra Pradesh. ISRO combined with Ministry of Health and various state governments are actually even now consulting and providing telecommunication to rural hospitals. Till date, actually, before this 2020 regulation came into being, telemedicine was offered as an informal mode of consultation. So patients used to message or email. There were no legal guidelines on how it should be conducted, how the processes, what processes should be followed, what should not be followed. This is why in the year, and this actually a lot of confusion came into being in the year 2018 with this judgment of Bombay High Court, which was a landmark case, and it highlighted the issues relating to the problems in telecommunication. So this judgment, basically in this judgment, two doctors were convicted and they were charged, an FIR was filed against them and they were charged with culpable homicide not amounting to murder, and their bail was refused because they treated a patient telephonically and passed on instructions to the nurses, which ultimately resulted in the patient dying, and the doctors could not reach the hospital on time. So the court came out very strictly against the doctors and they refused to grant them bail. And after this judgment, there was a lot of hue and cry, and the medical bodies appealed to the Medical Council of India to frame teleconsultation guidelines. Till 2 years, nothing happened. And because of COVID, now the telemedicine practice guidelines actually were essential to keep up with patient needs as well as for doctors' regulations. So as of date, these legislations, which you can see on your screen, are covering teleconsultation, as well as they cover consultation through face-to-face patient consultation as well. So all these legislations, including Drugs and Cosmetics Act, Indian Medical Council regulations, Council Act, Information Technology Act, all of them specifically do not mention telemedicine, but all of them contain provisions which are equally applicable to telemedicine as well. So, for example, in the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, there are lists of drugs are mentioned which are permissible to be given over the counter and which are permissible, which are to be given only after a prescription. So all these have been adopted in the new telemedicine guidelines. Similarly, in the Indian Medical Council Professional Etiquette and Ethics Regulations, these essentially govern various issues relating to patient-doctor confidentiality, collection of data from patients, issues of consent, etc. So actually, telemedicine guidelines which came in last year are a part of these regulations. So they have to be read as part and parcel of these ethics regulations as well. So the same rules that are there in professional conduct and ethics regulations are applicable to telemedicine guidelines as well. Then Information Technology Act. This does not talk about telemedicine as such, but it governs everywhere where there is exchange of electronic data. So as a doctor who's collecting data, as an institution that is collecting data, we are governed by Information Technology Act and subsequent rules. There are specific rules which are applicable to entities like ours who are processing, collecting, and sharing data. And everywhere there is a mandatory requirement that we have to take consent, whoever's data we are sharing to a third party. In fact, there are very severe penalties and liabilities to resting with a hospital as well as persons responsible for sharing those data in case there are non-compliances with respect to Information Technology Act. So, for example, if a data is shared without knowledge of the patient, it can result in penalty under the telemedicine guidelines as well as under the Information Technology Act. So one important difference I would like to share now, which is what is the difference between Act and a guideline. So Act is basically a law which has come into force. Guidelines are not law as such, but they are guiding factors. So they are to be read as part and parcel of the Act. So violation of these guidelines do not as such result in any penalties or convictions, but it is advisable to follow these guidelines in order to save ourselves from malpractice litigations. So now now that I've given a brief background, I'll start with what is there in the telemedicine guidelines and what is important to consider before initiating a telemedicine consult with a patient. So these are the 7 things which are important to consider before and during any telemedicine consultation. The first step is, as a doctor, you have to identify whether a teleconsult is required. What is in the best interest of the patient? So if an in-person consultation is preferred, then the doctor has to insist on an in-person consultation and should not go ahead with the teleconsultation process. Once this is established, then initially the consultation has to start with the so RMP. I'm in my slides that you see is essentially means registered medical practitioner. So the telemedicine guidelines mention this word RMP. That is why I'm using this. So RMP is a registered medical practitioner. So the first step is both the parties initiating the conversation and the doctor on the other side have to identify themselves. So it cannot be anonymous. So both the parties, a doctor has to identify by stating their registration number and their name. A patient has to identify. There have to be mechanisms in place to ensure that the papers before you or the patient who's approaching you is the right person and not somebody else on their behalf. This is very important because doctor cannot consult with a minor patient without the presence of a guardian. So age has to be established. How to establish that age? Then verification mechanisms have to be put in place where a doctor is within their right to ask for age proof, to ask for an Aadhaar proof if they want, to ask for a birth certificate if they are not sure. Any point during the consultation, if a doctor is unsure or may feel that the patient is actually projecting themselves to be 20 years of age and is only 15, at any time when there is a doubt, a doctor can stop that consultation and ask for verification papers. Then, especially if a prescription, it is important to ask for age. RMP, as I mentioned, a doctor also has to identify. There is no mandatory requirement to share the registration number while initiating a consult, but it is ideally preferred to ensure that the patient is able to identify the doctor and they are in a position to state that they have consulted with the doctor of their choice and who they wanted to consult. The next is mode of communication. So a doctor has full authority to decide what mode of communication they can use. So a patient may initiate a conversation or a communication through any mode, but the doctor can decide whether they want to continue that mode or not. So if a patient makes a telephonic call and the doctor feels that an audio call will not be sufficient to take forward the consultation, they may switch to an video call. So these guidelines state what are the strengths and weaknesses of all the modes of communication. So these regulations actually permit audio, video, and text communication. So by text, I mean WhatsApp and Messenger communications. So all these are permitted, but case-to-case basis, the doctor has to decide which is the best medium of consultation. So, for example, if there is a patient with an eye infection, so it is preferred that the doctor should ask for a visual consultation before prescribing any medication. Then, I'll come to the consent. Consent also I will deal a little more in detail at the end. But briefly, I'll just mention consent here. That consent, there are two types of consent. So one is an implied consent and the other is an express consent. Implied consent basically means the patient has initiated the communication and patient has agreed to take forward this consultation. So when in our institute also there are, when a patient enters the telecommunication room or website, they have to explicitly agree to the terms and conditions. So they are agreeing to be examined by the doctor. This is exactly the same as how it is in when a patient comes face to face with a doctor. So when they enter an OPD, it is implied that they have consented to be examined. They have consented that their blood pressure will be taken. They have consented that they can be examined by this particular doctor. If the second type of consent is express consent. So express consent is needed when a child is there, when a person who is incapacitated or an unsound mind has somebody, a caregiver with them. So express consent has to be taken of the caregiver to examine the person with them. Then the next is type of consultation. So it is important actually to identify what is the type of consultation. By type of consultation, I mean whether it is a first consultation or it is a follow-up. Accordingly, this is important to identify because the guidelines prescribe what are the medicines that can be prescribed in first consultation and what are the medicines that cannot be prescribed in first consultation or can only be prescribed in follow-up consultation. So first consultation, what does first consultation mean? So basically first consultation is when patient has come for the first time. The another definition of first consultation is basically the patient has consulted with the doctor earlier, but more than 6 months have elapsed and the patient has in the first consultation. So the second consultation and first follow-up has to be within a period of 6 months. If the same patient comes back again, it is not a first consultation if he comes with a new health condition or a different health condition. So follow-up follow-up consultation, of course, is the same opposite to the first consultation, that more than 6 months have elapsed with the previous consultation and or an old patient has come with a new condition. So even if that patient comes within 6 months but presents a new condition, that is considered as a first consultation. So there can be a situation where a patient has come within 6 months explaining or in continuation of the first consultation, but during the course of that follow-up, the RMP discovers a new medical condition. So at that point of time, the doctor has to note down and indicate that this is going to be a first consultation and has to start with the process of first as a new consultation. Now I'll talk about patient evaluation. Now, the doctor is the best judge to understand what is the type of consultation required. So what is the type of consultation required, and they have the authority to gather as much information as they can from the patient before they pass any before they prescribe any medication, before a condition is diagnosed. So until and unless an RMP is sure that they have sufficient material to diagnose, it is preferred that a diagnosis or a prescription should not be filled. And if any point of time an RMP feels that the information provided to them is not sufficient, that or that further examination is needed by in-person consultation, at that time the RMP can pause, or they can end the teleconsultation and request the person to appear in person if possible. So then the last important element is patient management. Now patient management basically covers health counseling, health education, and medication. Now medication is a very important aspect in telemedicine guidelines. So not all medicines can be prescribed by way of teleconsultation. So RMP actually can prescribe medicines only when they are satisfied that they have enough information about the condition, and patient's best interest has to be kept in mind. As is the case with in-person consultation, appropriate diagnosing an ailment or prescribing a medication without sufficient information amounts to professional misconduct. This is the same case as in in-person consultation as well. Now, these medicines are the ones that can be prescribed, and I'll quickly go through all of them. So there are few lists that are provided. First is the list O. Now list O essentially means those medicines which are over-the-counter medicines, and they can be prescribed through any mode of consultation. So over-the-counter is, as you'd all be aware, the ORS solutions, paracetamol, common cough, not syrups, but common cough tablets, and all these things can be prescribed under this group O category. These again can be prescribed through video, audio, or text. The next group is A list. These medicines are usually which can be prescribed during the first consult, but preferred mode is only video. So in these instances, ideally video, the doctor should visually see the patient before prescribing any medicine. These medicines are usually relatively safe. There are no potential to, very less potential to abuse. But medications, for example, in the case of, for example, eye drops, prescription of eye drops for conjunctivitis, that cannot be given by audio or a text consultation. That can only be given by video consultation. This is a list of medicines can also be prescribed in follow-ups. So, for example, a refill for illness such as diabetes, hypertension, asthma can also be prescribed, but not in first consultation, in follow-up consultation only. Then the next list is the B list. Now, B list is, these are also add-on medications which are used for treating an existing condition. So, for example, a patient has already been given medications for hypertension or blood pressure, and the medicines are not effective. So these medicines in this list can be prescribed through any mode of communication, but only as an add-on to the existing medication. The list of medicines that are actually covered under these separate groups are not yet been provided by the government. Drugs and Cosmetics Act lists out some general guidelines, but specific medications are not yet provided by the government. The final list is the prohibited list. Now, this is specifically laid down in the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. These are under the heading of Schedule X, and the medicines under the Narcotics Act are specifically prohibited. They cannot be prescribed through any mode of consultation. Whether it is a first consult, second consult, whether it is video, audio, text, either ways it cannot be prescribed. Actually, there was a recent case of a Bollywood actor who had died by suicide, and an FIR was registered against the doctor who had prescribed medication to the actor's sister which were classified as drugs under the Narcotics and Psychotropic Substances Act. So an FIR for non-bailable offense was registered against that doctor. and the investigation is still going on. So this list actually is very, very important to remember while prescribing medicines. To be on the safer side, till the guidelines become more clearer and the list of medications are out, it is advisable that only general medications which do not have excess side effects should be prescribed. Then I'll move on to how the teleconsult has to proceed. So there are 5 situations in which a teleconsult can happen. Firstly, it can happen between a patient and a registered medical practitioner. Then it can happen through a patient. It can happen between a patient through a caregiver. It can happen between patient and a health worker. It can happen between a registered between 2 doctors. And finally, it can happen in emergency situation. I'll walk through the process briefly in every type of consultation. So the first I'll discuss about patient and a registered medical practitioner. So in the first consult, this flowchart actually is very nicely given in the telemedicine guidelines. So if anybody is not able to see or read the details, they can pick it up from that, or else I'll email it to Dr. Anju. So firstly, the patient will initiate a consultation. Once the patient initiates that consultation, it is and consent is implied. So no express consultation is required. Patient can initiate through video, audio, or text consultation. Patient will initiate, registered practitioner will accept. So this forms a contract between both the parties. I'll explain about the contractual relationship a little later. Now, once the communication has been established, the patient has to be identified. So the doctor has to ensure that the patient is correct, the age is correct, and the details given, whatever details are shared by the patient, they are correct, whatever he has. A quick assessment has to be done. If there's an emergency consult, an emergency first aid can be advised, but the doctor has to ensure, actually must definitely mandatorily recommend that of nearest hospital, the patient should go to the nearest hospital after first aid relief measures are given by the doctor. If there is no emergency, then all relevant information has to be collected, all history, investigation records, everything has to be taken down. This is actually very important because all the details have to be documented, and a digital trail has to be maintained for every conversation between a doctor and a patient. So at any point of conversation or telecommunication, the doctor has full authority to ask or to change the mode of communication. So if, for example, an audio consultation is going on, and during the consultation, the doctor feels that visual representation is more important to identify the problem, they may request the patient, and they may take his consent to switch to a video consultation. If once appropriate, once all details are for patient evaluation are collected, doctor has to ensure that whether this can be managed by telemedicine. If it can be managed by telemedicine, then they can prescribe lists which were mentioned in list O. If, however, the doctor feels that the patient cannot be managed by telemedicine, then they may ask that they may cancel the consultation at any point. They may ask the patient to come for in-person consultation. There may be times when the patient is insisting for telecommunication, and the doctor may feel that telecommunication is not suitable. Doctor is within their right to cancel that teleconsult, put it in writing, record it, that as abundance of caution, it is suggested that the patient should be seen visually or in person, and the doctor, it doesn't matter if the patient is insisting, all rights are with the doctor to cancel or teleconsult anytime it feels inappropriate. Similarly, patient also has a right to discontinue the teleconsultation. So doctor cannot insist that the patient should see that particular doctor only, and they should not coerce the patient to initiate a discussion or to mandatorily see that particular doctor only. Now, after first consult, then the next follow-up consultation between patient and an RFP happens. So the same process is there. Patient will establish a communication. The next step is the doctor has to identify whether the same person is there for follow-up or not. This can be done by verifying identity details, which were done earlier. If at any point the RMP is unsure of the identity, they can request, they can ask, they can cancel the communication. They can reinitiate if suppose a patient has initiated a call through some other registered number, and the RMP can insist that the patient should communicate through that registered number or registered device, which is, if that's a part of the ecosystem. So once the patient initiates the consent, it is implied. Again, the same process of first consultation is to be followed. If there's an emergency situation, then the first aid referral has to be made. First aid measures should be provided, and then a referral for patients to appropriate healthcare facility. Detailed patient evaluation, and then the whole process. Now, as a follow-up, a doctor may prescribe any medication in list O, and if there is a video consultation, then the doctor can prescribe in list B. Then the next mode of communication that can happen is between patient and RMP through a caregiver. So who is a caregiver? Caregiver can be a family member or any person who is specifically authorized by the patient. So there are two situations where a caregiver can come. So first, caregiver can come when there is a minor. If the patient, when the patient is 18 years or less, or a patient is incapacitated, for example, has a medical condition of dementia or is of unsound mind, caregiver can be present during the consultation. If, however, patient is not present with the caregiver, then explicit consent has to be taken by the patient, which the caregiver has to share to the RMP. Only then the telecommunication should proceed. Now, I had mentioned that the relationship between a patient and a doctor is a contractual relationship. So this is applicable through telecommunication, and this is applicable through face-to-face consultation also. Any relationship between a patient and a doctor is a contractual relationship, and it is a duty of an RMP to ensure that the other person they are entering into the contract with is of unsound mind, is not of unsound mind, has a capacity to enter into a contract. If they don't, then they have to enter into a contract with somebody else. By contract, I don't mean that you have to sign the papers. By contract, I mean it's an implied contract between both the parties. Then the next mode of communication happens between a health worker and a registered medical practitioner. So health worker actually is, the government identifies some categories of people with minimum basic qualifications to be health workers. Besides those, any nurse comes under the category of a health worker. Any allied health professional comes under the category of a health worker. So in the flowchart that you see, initially health worker will establish a contact with the patient. They have to identify the patient, and they, on behalf of the patient, they have to initiate a mode of communication, either video, audio, or text consultation. Then the RMP and the patient both have to identify themselves. Consent of the patient has to be obtained. That health worker can also be present or cannot be present. Either ways, it is up to the patient to decide. So there may be instances, for example, in an old age home where a nurse is taking care of a patient who is old in age. So they may have dementia and they may not be in a position to give consent. So in that case, the health worker can initiate on their own behalf, take medication, but identification of the patient should be done. Then again, the same process has to be there. If there's an emergency care needed, then they have to proceed accordingly. If no emergency is there, then they have to take patient evaluation. They have to ask for additional information. All these steps have to be ensured. So in case, again, if the patient cannot be managed by way of telemedicine, then they can recommend specific treatment to the health worker. Suppose they may prescribe medication sorry, suppose the medication, the teleconsult is appropriate and can be proceeded by the facts given to them, the RMP can proceed and they can prescribe medications to the healthcare worker, who will then administer the medicines on their behalf. Again, for all these things, specific notings have to be there, specific consent has to be obtained if a person is of sound mind. Then the other situation, the other two situations that can arise are between two doctors, so RMP and another RMP. So there might be a situation where a doctor might need consult of a super specialist or for a patient under their care. So the guidelines actually recommend that they can consult with another RMP through the telecommunication method. They can ask for advice, but it is important to remember that the patient remains the treating RMP's patient and does not become a patient of the other RMP. So the other RMP is merely in an advisory position, will give advice, but the patient essentially remains of the treating RMP. Guidelines actually do not specify whether the data of the patient can be shared without consent, but in all prudence and in all, for all to ensure that we don't end up in litigations, it is recommended that before sharing any patient data with any doctor, consent should be obtained. At least de-identification of the data should be done before sharing it. Then in emergency situations, of course, telemedicine can be done. Without any consent, it can proceed. The doctor has to ensure the first step, as is the case with all face-to-face consultations also, the first step is to treat the emergency situation if it can be done through teleconsultation mode, and then advise that in-person care should be done at the soonest. They can facilitate referral to the nearby hospital also. They can advise first aid through through this mode of telecommunication also. Either ways, the patient should be and mandatorily has to be advised to go for an in-person interaction at the earliest, so that the situation does not become worse. Now, what are the duties and responsibilities of a doctor? So these are all not just confined to telemedicine. These are actually applicable to all to a face-to-face consultation also, and these are provided in the ethics regulations as well. So common principles which everybody is aware of, that principles of medical ethics and patient confidentiality should be followed. With respect to data protection, actually, because of new legislations, one has to be very, very careful before sharing any digital data. IT Act and the new data protection bill, which is going to become an act very soon, places a lot of obligations on a person sharing data on an institute like ours, which is collecting such a huge amount of data. Proper mechanisms have to be in place, and if there is breach from a person's end, then penalties amounting to imprisonment and fines can also be, heavy fines can also be imposed. So there might be a situation where a WhatsApp group is created by a doctor. Suppose a doctor has patients suffering from a particular ailment, and to disseminate information regarding that particular ailment, doctor decides to create a WhatsApp group and adds 10 patients to that number. Now, this is technically not allowed, because you should take consent of every person who's added in that WhatsApp group, because a person might not be comfortable with sharing their the fact that they suffer from a particular ailment with other 9 strangers. So all these things you have to be very careful, especially now with new technologies with WhatsApp, and doctors can share patient information very easily. At every step, precaution should be there. All this is to ensure that at a later stage, if the patient might not put an allegation against the doctor that their data was breached. People are also becoming more and more aware of the control they have on their data. So now we can't, you have to keep up to date with what the data policies and legislations are at force in India. Then, of course, all digital trail has to be maintained, all communications, all WhatsApp. If a patient calls at odd hours in the night, the doctor has full responsibility not to take that call. Then there is no compulsion on the doctor to take a call unless there's an emergency, of course. Um, and also, if the doctor decides to consult telephonically outside the office hours or outside the telecommunication room or through their phone, they can maintain their logs, they can maintain written documentation of all the conversations or all prescription that was given, if any, or all the symptoms that were shared by the patient. Now, this slide, I'm not going to go too much in detail. This is similar to what is there in face-to-face consultation also. This is essentially to inform that a patient has a right to initiate civil, criminal, and consumer protection proceedings against a doctor, even if the consultation has happened through teleconsultation also. So civil proceedings can happen. A patient can initiate any case. A patient can initiate a consumer protection case of deficiency in services. All this I'll explain when I come to informed consent again. So now I will briefly touch on informed consent, which I feel is a very, very essential topic, and a lot of litigations result from not taking a proper consent. While consent in surgical procedures is it's a very important thing, I will briefly talk about informed consent in day-to-day consultations. So while it is important to remember that informed consent is essentially relies on the principle that the patient has complete autonomy over their body. So patient has complete control over what they want and what information, what they are within their right to agree for a consultation or to deny the consultation, to agree for any procedure which has been prescribed or to deny any procedure that has been prescribed. So this is very important that a patient has to be given control over what if they want to agree or if they don't want to agree. So that this is important so that they can make a rational decision whenever they want to undergo a treatment, if they want to proceed with the treatment or not. Actually, the informed consent was not very popular earlier. It just came into being with the case of very important case, actually VP Shanta's case. It was around the year 96 when the when the Supreme Court decided that medicine services are to be regulated under Consumer Protection Act. So prior to that, any negligence used to either be by way of civil proceedings or by way of criminal proceedings. Now that medicine services come under the purview of Consumer Protection Act, medicine is consultation comes under the definition of services. So we are, as doctors, you are performing a service to a patient, and if there is any deficiency in the service, the patient is within their right to approach a Consumer Protection Act, allege deficiencies, prove those deficiencies, and which can result in punishment to the doctor. The Consumer Protection Act cannot prescribe criminal punishments, of course. They can only prescribe civil punishments, which are penalties, or they can also recommend the MCI to suspend or cancel the registration. Now, what are the essential components of an informed consent? So I had mentioned earlier that I briefly explained about the doctor-patient relationship, and it is a contractual relationship. So every relationship, any other relationship which is guided by a contract, this is also quite similar. So a landlord or tenant will have a contractual relationship. A patient and a doctor will have a contractual relationship. So contract essentially has few elements which are essential before a contract is valid. So for that to be valid, the first thing is the other side both the parties actually have to have the mental capacity to enter into a contract. So you cannot enter into a contract with a person who is of unsound mind or who is a minor. This is why in informed consent and in medical procedures, it is essential that a minor has to be accompanied by a guardian who will give his or her consent. Similarly, with an unsound mind person, person accompanying that person should be able to give their consent. Without that, the contract or the relationship is invalid. Now, there has to be voluntary acceptance by the patient. So this is also an essential of a contract, that the contract is entered freely between the parties. So voluntary acceptance of the procedure of the patient is important. So doctor should not keep on insisting that this is the right way, this is the only way. The only thing as doctors that can be done is you give all the information, you give all the pros and cons of a particular treatment, of a particular diagnosis of a particular medication, and choice has to be left to the patient. Another important point of informed consent is it should not be a general informed consent. It should be a person and procedure specific informed consent. Now, what is to be included in that informed consent? Usually we have an informed consent form that can be shared that can be shared online with the patient. Usually we have the physical paper where the patient signs. By way of teleconsultation, we can record, if we are recording the consultation, it can be verbally, the consent can be verbally, visually and audio visually recorded. So what is there in the consent? Consent essentially should contain what is the condition of the patient, what is the nature and purpose of intervention, what are the consequences of such an intervention, if there are any alternative available, that should be informed to the patient. What are the risks involved of a particular medication, or risks involved if the patient does not go ahead with the treatment? What are the immediate and future costs that are anticipated? All of this should be in a language that is understood by the patient, so that the patient is able to take an informed decision. Again, it goes back to how the patient has complete autonomy over their body, and they have to take an informed decision. Now, there are some exceptions to informed consent. So, what exceptions to informed consent basically means in what conditions informed consent can be done away with. Of course, in emergency situations, there is no time to take consent. Ideally, actually, there are provisions in the Indian Penal Code which say that a doctor can treat without consent of the patient if the patient is unconscious, mentally ill, or is in need for an emergency life-saving treatment. Section 92 of the Indian Penal Code says this. Then ideally it is advised that after the procedure is done, consent can be taken of the attendant. The next is doctrine of loco parentis. Now, loco parentis is a Latin term which actually means that parents are replaced by another person. So if suppose a child is in a school and has an injury, and the parents or a guardian are not available, the teacher can assume the role of a loco parentis, can come get the child to the hospital and give their consent for the treatment. In this case, it is not necessary that a parent or a guardian has to give their consent. Again, with incompetent patients such as those who are delirious or who are of unsound mind and are not able to take a rational decision, they can also be treated without informed consent, especially if there is no attendant present with that patient. Now, another thing is doctrine of therapeutic privilege. So, if a doctor suspects that a patient, if they pass on the full information or a diagnosis to the patient can suffer from further ailments, or can have a detrimental effect on his or her health. So, in that case, the doctor has the right to disclose everything to the attendant or the relative who is attending with that patient, and he can get that in writing that the doctor can get that in writing that there is a possibility that disclosing full diagnosis or giving full diagnosis to the patient can be detrimental to the patient's health. I think I've tried to cover everything. Now I'll just give a brief summary so that you can remember all the important things that have been there. So the telecommunication guidelines essentially give a lot of right to the doctor. So a doctor can choose the medium of consultation. Doctor can change the medium of consultation at any time during the consultation. They can they can insist on the patient coming in person during a consultation also. Doctor also has to maintain the same standard of care during teleconsultation as they would do in an in-person consultation, but it has to be remembered that telemedicine has their own set of limitations. Accordingly, medicines have to be prescribed. Then a patient actually is responsible for the accuracy of information. So a doctor can take this as a defense that if information is not correctly provided, the diagnosis may differ accordingly. So it is not the doctor's responsibility to ensure that the information given, it is not the doctor's responsibility to verify all the information that has been given by the patient. So if a patient gives wrong information, suppose they give a wrong information about their age and they produce a false identity card. So the doctor has actually tried their best to ensure that the patient produced the verification documents, and they were satisfied that the patient is a major, even though later on they may allege that we were a minor and we are not seen. So the onus at that time is on the doctor to maintain proper documentation that verification of documents was done to ensure that the patient is a major. So that can come to the doctor's defense at a later stage if there is a litigation against the doctor. Then it is assumed that the caregiver accompanying a minor or an incapacitated patient is authorized and can give the informed consent. And telemedicine guidelines specifically mention it can it gives actually two conditions where a caregiver without presence of the patient can also go ahead on formal authorization by the patient. Now, these are some do's and don'ts for RMPs to remember. All this I have mentioned, just a quick recap. Patient identification is mandatory during first consultation. As an RMP, you have to be satisfied that the patient you are consulting is the correct patient, the age is correct as has been mentioned in the records. Patient identification confirmation actually is not mandatory during follow-up consultation, but as abundance of caution, it is advisable that you take identity confirmation again. So there might be a case where during the first consultation, the doctor does not realize that the patient is a minor, but during a follow-up consultation, doubts may arise, which may prompt the RMP to ask for identification documents. All of this is actually permissible. Then where a caregiver is involved, so doctor has to ensure that authorization is proper, caregiver's identity is proper, so that there is no misuse, there is no anything else which can happen which the doctor may not be aware of. So again, I'd mentioned that caregiver cannot consult unless the patient is authorized or a patient is a minor. So doctor has to ensure all these things. Then it is advisable that an RMP should identify themselves before start of any teleconsultation. The guidelines also mention that at every checkpoint, every conversation point, an RMP should disclose their registered medical number. So if there are written communications, if there are audio communications, proper formal consent, even to the terms of saying, asking the patient, do you give consent for the patient who will identify themselves, for the doctor who will identify themselves, and the patient has to give in these many words that I give consent to be examined by the doctor telephonically. Then doctor at any point, I had mentioned before, at any time they can cancel a teleconsultation if they feel that this is not appropriate. They can switch the mode of telecommunication at any time if the need arises. Then again, digital trail has to be maintained, all patient records have to be maintained, all medical reports, blood test reports, everything has to be properly maintained. Now, personal data, patient's data should not be disclosed or transferred without written consent. Prior to these IT acts and the personal data bill, it was comparatively easier for personal data to be shared because there were no repercussions. Now, there are very strict legislations, there are very strict repercussions, and so the new data bill which has been coming out it classifies some information called as a sensitive data information. Now, this sensitive information includes medical records as well. So none of this should be disclosed by a doctor to anybody without authorized written consent. Written consent is important because in future it may end up, doctors may end up in trouble if a patient alleges that their data was shared to some third party without their written consent. Then again, no emergency consultation should be denied, but it should be limited only to immediate assistance, and the RMP should insist on face-to-face consultation or a nearest consultation, physical consultation if possible. That's all. I think I've covered everything. Thank you. If at any time anybody gets stuck in any consultation, please feel free to email legal, and we'll try to answer promptly.
Thanks, Mrs. Seema. That was a very relevant topic that we covered.
Does anybody have any questions or queries?
Questions? Feel free to ask.
Pass on to
the chat box. Dr. Seema, Mrs. Seema, with respect to the having this recording, which can be done, when you said sharing of patients' data and other things, which is like a repercussions being there.
Yeah.
So the recording of a teleconsultation can be done, or is it like with a mutual consent or without a person knowing if it's been recorded?
Ideally, consent should be taken. The patient should be aware that their recording teleconsult is being recorded. Ideally, consent should be there. There are no guidelines as such. They doesn't specify anything about recording a consultation. But for our safety purposes, we should, when we are recording, we should take a consent from the patient.
Any further questions?
So like this recording, ideally, I should have been consented with, and before the recording should have proceeded. So legally, under the data bill, actually, this things are getting a little difficult in terms of digital ecosystem. So it's a very new sphere. So everywhere, cautionary steps have to be taken to ensure that we don't end up into trouble.
Any further questions? So, like how Mrs. Seema was saying, this lecture will soon be uploaded in the Department of Medicine YouTube website with consent. Hopefully, everyone, rest of the people who have not been able to access this will be able to benefit from that. Now, I think we'll move on to Mrs. Divya V. She again is Assistant Legal Officer in CMC since 2019. She's completed BA, BL, and ML. And now, prior to CMC, Mrs. Divya has been working, had an experience as a court practice has been done at the ASGI office in the Madras High Court Council for NHAI. Experience also with the corporate offices and in contract management and legal support services. So now we'll be handing over to ma'am with respect to cover topics on medical legal cases. If any questions through the lecture, please feel free to put down the chat box. Again, thanks to Mrs. Divya ma'am for agreeing to take this lecture for us. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now I'll be sharing my screen for the presentation. Screen visible?
It's visible, Mrs. Divya. Can you hear me? It's visible.
Yes, thank you. So
Yeah, thank you.
let's look into some of the legal aspects in handling medical legal cases. So generally people fear medical legal cases, and it is presumed that only government doctors handle medical legal cases. But in India, we are also dealing with medical legal cases as private practitioners after Supreme Court intervention from the year 1989. So let's see uh, from the beginning, from the definition, and move to each part. So primarily, the definition of a medical legal case may be: it is a case of an injury or illness that the doctor is attending, and he or she feels that after examining the patient and getting detailed history, that the intervention of a law enforcement agency like police is essential to establish and fix responsibility for in accordance with the law of the land. That is, for in simple words, it's a legal case requiring medical expertise to decide responsibility. So generally, these types of cases, what happens is uh, there will be a assailant and there will be a victim. So the victim will be the patient coming to the doctor, and who is the assailant, or how the responsibility should be fixed, or to what extent the injury is, and to what extent the punishment is to be given. All this can be decided only after the medical person is giving his expert advice. So there is one basic difference between medical legal cases and medical negligence cases. Generally, cases are misunderstood. So medical legal cases are cases where the doctor is called to court as an expert to give his or her opinion. But a medical negligence case is filed against the doctor or hospital for criminal negligence or even civil negligence. Then, if a MLC case is not handled properly, it can become a ground to allege medical negligence, that proper care was not given. In all medical negligence cases, due and reasonable care is not provided is the main allegation against the doctor, and it can go up to imprisonment of the professional. So these are generally called as malpractice cases. Various medical legal cases are expert evidence cases. Then, as said by Ms. Sina, the relationship between a doctor and patient is bound by contract. So they have to fulfill certain requirements, and MLC examination and reporting is one such legal responsibility under Section 39 of the Criminal Procedure Code. All doctors, irrespective of whether they are public or private practitioners, when they attend patients, they are supposed to report to the police immediately when an MLC case comes. So let's see what are all the different types of MLC cases that a doctor may receive. The doctor may receive 4 types of cases. One is the general suspicious cases which come to him after taking history and thorough examination. The doctor feels that there is some foul play, and immediately he will note this case as an MLC case. Next is an MLC case which is found by police and is brought to the hospital for examination or reporting. Then, by the directive of a court, the court feels, while deciding certain aspects, court thinks that a medical expert is necessary to decide on this. Mostly these type of directives come from court are for forensic science. Next is an already registered MLC case is transferred, because hospital like CMC is a tertiary care hospital where a lot of specialties are available. So it may not be available in a general hospital, in a small hospital, or in a single consultant room hospital. But when the patient comes there, the doctor records it as an MLC and then transfers the patient to a tertiary care hospital for further procedures and further examining. Generally, what types of cases that come as MLCs are RTAs, generally traffic accidents, railway accidents, factory accidents, or any unnatural mishap that may happen. It may be suspected or it may be evident homicide or suicide cases. So homicide cases are in common man languages, any murder type of cases that harm to physical body of person, which may lead up to death, is generally called as homicide. Then there is suspected and evident cases of poisoning. A person may on his own take poison, or may be given by another person, or by accident. Even consumption of liquid petrol, thinking white petrol, thinking it as water, is a suspected case of poisoning. So for this also, an MLC must be registered. It may be an accident, but it may be even upon investigation lead to some foul play. So it's better to go for an MLC. Then there are burn injuries. Burn injuries, irrespective of what it is a MLC case. Then there are injury cases where foul play is there, and injury cases where there is likelihood of death in the near future, and all sexual assault cases. Even if the patient or the relative doesn't want to make it as a case, but the responsibility is on the doctor. So all sexual assault cases and abuse cases are MLCs. Any suspected or evident criminal abortions, particularly when the fetus is a female, are MLC cases. Then there are unconscious cases where the reason is not known, like patient is brought in coma, those type of situations. Then there are brought death cases where there is suspicion of foul play. And finally, cases which the court refers. So at what time should a person do it as an MLC? There are some doubts whether they should do it in the beginning or whether only when after results come. No, immediately when you feel that there is a foul play, go and register it as an MLC. If it is not an MLC, no problem. But if there is no foul play, it's not a problem. However, when you know it is a burn injury, when you know it is a injury or a sexual offense or sexual assault, please go for an MLC. That is most advisable. Then when the patient comes, generally they don't give a lot of information. They withhold some information, and only after detailed clinical examination, the doctor comes to know that this is an MLC. So the doctor should register as soon as he knows that it is an MLC after detailed finding. Then he will file it as an MLC. Generally, emergency department is a place where you get a lot of emergency cases, and it becomes an MLC. But sometimes after this clinical finding comes in wards also, we may get MLC cases. So how do you deal with an MLC? Basically, first, as I stated in the very beginning, saving life is a priority. So one must save the life of the patient, and as doctors under the Hippocratic Oath, and our primary responsibility under MCA regulations is to save lives. So that is the first thing that we should do. Immediately go for first aid and renunciation of the patient. Next is record proper history, then inform police, then maintain your medical legal register, finally collect evidence, and importantly remember that females should have a female attendant with them at all times when you are examining. Next, the saving a life is a top priority was a Supreme Court verdict that came in the year 1989. Sorry, it was in the case of Paramananda Kakara versus Union of India, where it was a public interest litigation that was filed by Mr. Paramananda. He witnessed a particular person undergoing a very unfortunate accident, and he was taken to the hospital, and the doctor refused to take him in, saying that this is a police case, and he referred to the nearby government hospital. So in between the time that was taken from shifting the patient to a private hospital to the nearest government hospital, the patient died, and this particular case was filed as a public interest litigation, not to allege negligence against the doctor. So the MCI and IMA all were called in as parties, and the court framed certain guidelines that should be followed when a medical legal case comes to hospital. That is most likely an accident case that comes to a hospital. They said all legal formalities should be suspended until the patient is revived. So until the patient is stabilized, until you can you feel that the patient can give a statement and everything, until then the patient should not be disturbed, and all legal formalities are to be followed afterwards. But naming it as an MLC doesn't involve the patient. So give priority to naming it as an MLC and documenting from your part. Then stabilize the patient, and at last go for collection of evidence with the consent of the patient. So the court said that every doctor is bound to provide medical aid to victims irrespective of the cause of injury. He cannot take excuse of allowing law to take its course. So any delay for informing the police and not attending the patient is punishable in India. Then what is the doctor's role? Like always, remember to save and stabilize the patient first, then obtain history from the patient, and only exception to not getting consent from the patient is if the particular patient was brought in by a police officer above the rank of a sub-inspector. You need not get consent if he is not cooperating for the investigation. And this particular examination is going to provide evidence for uh, for proving the offense. So that is the only reason, and only in that case consent is not necessary in case of an MLC. So it's not for the patient but for the assailant. Then informing the police officer or constable on duty in hospital. Generally, all government hospitals have this. So it is better to inform the police, even if the patient or the guardian is not willing. Particularly in cases of sexual assault, people feel there will be a lot of intimidation and a lot of stigma against them if this becomes a case of media attention. So they don't feel that others should know about their condition, and they want to take the doctor's help for it also. So what happens is they feel that this is a matter of my privacy, please don't inform, or else they will come and if it may even be a suicide case, a suicide attempt case, where the particular person will say, no, please don't say about this to police and all. And you will think that, oh, this person is known to me for a long time. Please don't go like that. Don't go by your heart. If you suspect it is attempt to suicide, or if it is evident that is an attempt to suicide, or it is a sexual offense or a sexual abuse case, please inform the police as and when you come to know about this. And importantly, the sole responsibility of naming a case as MLC resides with the attending doctor. And go for collection of evidence before it's too late. As doctors, you are the prudent person to decide when to take dying declarations. So please do it before it's too late. Then when we come to discharge of a patient, please inform the chief medical officer that this MLC case is getting discharged, and get a clearance from the hospital that everything is okay, all evidence is okay, and the patient is stable and everything is okay. Then only the patient can be discharged. And in case of a patient absconding, please inform the nearby police, and against medical advice with DAMA or LAMA, MLC patient can't leave. Then there are documents that are to be given to document the care that you give to the patient. And most importantly, in doctor notes or prescription or whatever, always remember to write required numbers like registration number or employment number in all documents. Without writing your registration number or employment number, please don't fill in the forms. Then record all documents, all records and documents should be handed over to authorized persons only, not to anybody else. In case of death, please don't hand over the body to the relatives, even if you know them personally. Kindly accurately label it and send it to mortuary, and that particular police officer will initiate proceedings for a postmortem. Then give appropriate statement when you are called for expert evidence. It may be in the police station, it may be in the court. We don't have, as on date, we don't have any specific law, but there is guideline given by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, which is available online also. They are they have given very simple steps to follow, particularly for survivors and victims of sexual offense. First is, as I said, first aid, saving their life. Next is informed consent for examination. If they don't give consent, please don't examine. It's very, very important that you get informed consent. Then record detailed history. Then go for medical examination. Kindly estimate their age. Then collect evidence. Then document whatever you have collected. Then go for packing, sealing, and handing over of collected evidence to police. Treat injuries. Then test for further diseases like HIV or hepatitis B or pregnancy or any other sexually transmittable disease, infection which may happen. Most importantly, remember this patient is not only a patient but also a victim. So provide them psychological support and counseling, and if need be, refer them to shelters and coordinate for legal support. Then certain important things which are latest to be added. You may see it is this as 2012 and 2013, which are very old, but our legal laws are very, very old. They are like 1860 is Indian Penal Code, and 1903 is the Civil Procedure Code, and 1973 is our Criminal Procedure Code. So these are all latest additions. So under POSCO, the doctor, if he suspects that the child has been sexually abused, he is to be immediately reporting this to the police officer. And when the parent or guardian, if the doctor feels is not acting for the best interest of the minor, please inform Child Welfare Committee. In Vellore, you have Juvenile Justice Board, Sunshine, which is located in Officers Lane, and the phone number is also given here. So if you suspect that the parent or the guardian that has come with the minor is acting against the interest of the minor, go for the Child Welfare Committee. And this list is all the list that's applicable in the state of Tamil Nadu is also freely available on the internet. Even if you are working in other state or other place, kindly find out the details and go for appropriate action. Then post criminal law amendment, the lot of criminal laws like not only IPC or CRPC altogether were amended in 2013, more particularly with reference to acid attacks. So under this, if it is an acid attack case or a rape case, immediately the police should be informed and the hospital is to treat them free of costs. So this is the latest addition to criminal law. Then who prepares the MLC report? The doctor is to prepare the MLC report. The first contact doctor with the patient prepares in sexual assault cases. Now, if the particular victim is a female, they are to be handled by female doctors under section 53 of CRPC. And if a female doctor, if you are in a small hospital, there are only 2 male doctors, then go for help for a female attendant, like a nurse, should be present during the examination. Then in CLC, you have a separate form which you write for MLC cases. How we will fill this case, let's see. There are diagrams also. Fill them up appropriately wherever there is provision for diagrams where there you can mark such injuries in the diagram. Kindly mark it. Do not certify the cause of death, that is medical certification of cause of death in unnatural cases. It is for the forensic department, forensic lab of the government to decide. You will not decide the cause of death after postmortem. The government doctor will decide. Till now, all forensic reports are to be given only by government forensic lab. Even if you are a tertiary hospital and have your own forensic science department, this is to be decided only by the forensic science of the government, because all criminal cases the state takes onus, and all criminal cases the state only decides. If you see, generally it is versus Union of India or versus the state of Punjab or versus the state of Tamil Nadu. It's always like that. The state takes responsibility, and the state, an offense, particularly a criminal offense, is considered against the state. So only the state is sovereign authority to decide all these things. You have a forensic lab in Satvachari, so all these things are handed over to police and taken to the forensic lab there. Uh, More particularly for DNA, even in Vellore, we don't have something. Only in Chennai, there is a forensic lab for DNA examinations. And in CMC, there are two forms to fill up for deaths in case of MLCs. One is Form 4 for institutional deaths and Form 4A for non-institutional deaths. Take the appropriate forms and fill them with full names always. Generally, we have common Tamil names like, for example, my name is Divya. So Divya is a very, very common name. If you just write Divya, you will not know who that Divya is. If write full names, like uh, write it as Divya Varshini or Divya Vasigar or Divya Priya, whatever name it is, write full names. And in other words, write like they are daughter of Vasihar, daughter of so and so. Write the daughter of column or wife of column. In case of other people like male, write father's name generally, and whatever. Even if a single parent thing is coming and it is a female, write the mother's name. So always, not only names, also write a nearest guardian or nearest person to them. That is more important, along with identification marks. Identification marks, just don't write like a scar in the left cheek. Don't particularly identify how the mark is, whether it is uh, a slightly at what position it is, or how big it is, or whether it is embossed or it is inside, whatever mark. If it's a mole also, whether it is a mole which is that's flat or a raised mole, everything, mark your identification mark. Don't write the identification mark like a common man will write. Write it like how a doctor will write it. Then differentiate old and new injuries. When assault cases come, you may be able to identify that certain injuries are older and certain injuries are new. Differentiate the old and new injuries. More particularly in wound certification, write appropriate words like hurt and grievous hurt, because this is very, very useful in court to take to punish the particular person. And in motor accident cases, it's very important. So with this only, insurance amount ends up in the hand of a particular person, particular victim. Then when you dispatch your documents, please take acknowledgement from the police officer. This is a case in the Supreme Court where uh, medical legal case reports were not appropriate, and thereby justice was delayed. So the court came up with certain basic instructions or directions to maintain a MLC register. That should be in clear, legible handwriting. Generally, it's always a matter of joke of how doctors write their prescription. But if it is a MLC register, please write it as clearly as possible. It need not look beautiful, but it should be legible. And use simple words. Don't use complicated words with medical term, because this is going to be a medical legal report which is going to be read by non-medical people. So please help them understand and use as far as possible simple words. Then go for then don't go for short form or abbreviations. If there are two abbreviations for the same disease or something like that, it may be misunderstood and misinterpreted. Even tomorrow, if another doctor reads it, he may also not get what abbreviation you have written. So kindly avoid all those things. Next is always please put in your signatures, name and designation that you are boring, and write them very clearly so that anybody can read it. Next, there are certain guidelines to preservation of documents. Why are you supposed to preserve these documents? Because a case may start today, but it will not end in just 1 or 2 years. It will be going on. So at any point of time, when the case is going on, they will ask for original copies. So at that time, if you don't have records, you will be in trouble. And all original copies of certificates and reports issued for medical legal purposes are to be preserved till the case is finalized in a court of law. You have magistrate courts, then you have district courts, then you have high courts, lastly you have Supreme Court. Until the Supreme Court case gets over, you are supposed to preserve records. Generally, everything nowadays is electronical. Just ensure that if the MLC case is saved in that particular folder. Then MLC report is a very confidential document. It's not a public document because it involves privacy of a person, and the patient has, there is always the clause of confidentiality. Their records are to be confidential. It cannot be given to individuals. It cannot be given to even the relative of the particular patient. Only if need be for insurance or for the lawyer of the patient. The patient is approaching the court with their own individual lawyer. They don't want the lawyer appointed by court. So they go for their own lawyers. At that point of time, after obtaining NOC from the police, only then hand over MLC documents to them. Then what are the types of samples that generally in MLC cases? This list is not exhaustive. There may be also other things. Whatever that I came to know, I have written. So generally, in case of poisoning cases, what do you collect? And in case of alcoholic cases or drug abuse cases, or for DNA test, you go for blood. Then you collect clothes of the victim, where you can sense assault, injury, firearm or burn cases. You can collect clothes. Then you can take nail clippings, because there will be some amount of resistance in case of assault or rape. So there may be some DNA particles in the nail, so nail clippings. Then pellets and bullets in case of firearm injuries. Then swabs in case and pubic hair in case of rape cases. Then you have also swab for different things. Then you have washing of hands in case of firearm suicide cases. So when the firearm is fired, lot of gunpowder is in the person who's in the hand of the person who's firing the firearm. So washing of hands in firearm suicide cases will help to decide that this particular case was a suicide case. So it's more important. Then preserve all. The general instruction is preserving perishable evidence is very important. Then air dry your samples, particularly stained clothes. Don't wash them, or bullets with blood stain. Don't wash them. Air dry them. Don't sun dry, and pack them in paper envelopes. Don't go for plastic containers, and maintain chain of custody. Chain of custody is you write what are all the evidence in a piece of paper, and you mark where the particular documents are, whether it is in the hand of the doctor or whether it is handed over to police or whether it is from the prosecution side. Anywhere this may get lost. So start the chain of custody from your hand and note down that it has gone to the doctor, to the police, and hand over all these evidences within 24 hours and get acknowledgement on dispatch. Once you dispatch the evidence, kindly get it acknowledged so that tomorrow you and your institution can be safe. General instructions to go on with specific cases like broad death cases, when it is an unnatural death, when you suspect that is an unnatural death, or when you suspect there is some foul play in broad death cases, do not issue death certificates or hand over the dead body to relatives. Please inform police immediately, and they will send the body for you send the body for hospital mortuary for preservation. Then post-mortem examination will be done by the government doctor. Then you have Then you have uh, injury cases where complete documentation of the injuries, as I stated earlier, old and new injuries, big and small, raised or not, everything is to be recorded. Then mark them in appropriate diagrams and body maps. And when there is clothing of the patient available as evidence for injury, kindly collect it. When you recover bullets from the body, mark them and photograph them along with the scale. That is the general procedure that's done. If you collect glass pieces from different parts of the body, pack them in different paper covers and give your opinion in severity of the injuries. As I said, previous hurt and hurt. Then if there are X-ray reports, injuries, join those X-ray reports and things so that it will be useful for the next person in line to decide. Then for burn cases, percentage of burn, if you see even in insurance, third degree burns, they have one type of compensation. Second degree burns have one type of compensation, and first degree burns have one type of compensation. So it's very important to note down what is the percentage of burns in case of burn cases. Then articles soiled with such inflammables like burnt piece of clothing or scalp and hair, all this can be collected, and collect blood for you may think why for burn injury, but for burn injury, for carbon monoxide levels, collection of blood is also advised. Then for poisoning cases, generally the vomitus is collected along with the soiled clothing, and preserve blood or urine or any relevant body fluid depending on the poison that is ingested. It may be a snake bite, it may be a poisonous gas, it may be even accidental drinking of petrol, something like that. But for everything, please collect appropriate evidence. And most importantly, for sexual offences, it's very important that the medical examination is done in a particular way. That's why I've given exact legislation piece in front of your eyes. So when an offense of rape or attempt to rape is done, the particular person is examined with the consent of the women, or else they are not. And it is done within 24 hours of the particular patient arriving. Then what is expected of a registered medical practitioner is that without delay, they examine the person and prepare report. What are the particulars that is necessary? They take down the name and address of the person, and who was brought and with whom she came, and you estimate the age of the particular woman. Then you take description that is given by the woman or the person, and you go for DNA profiling. Then injuries are marked. Then general mental condition of the woman is also noted down, and other material particulars which need reasonable details are to be collected. Then this report is to state what is the conclusion. You conclude this injury is a grievous hurt. So you have to give reasons why you have concluded that it is a grievous hurt. Then you will have to specifically record the consent of the woman before you start your examination. Then record exact time when you start examination, when you complete. Both are to be noted in the report. And without any delay, you will forward this report to the investigating officer, who will take it to the magistrate for further processing. Then, whatever may be, nothing in this section, which this is a very interesting in return part, which talks about informed refusal. Let's see the next slide on informed refusal. But this is a right of a woman who is sexually assaulted, and she can deny consent. That is taken from this. And the concept of informed refusal, particularly in cases of sexual assault or abuse, the victim will not be in a mental state to give appropriate evidence. So she will refuse for consent. No court or person can force a victim or in other words the survivor to consent for the same. And in such cases, importance of examination and collection of evidence should be explained to the survivor by the doctor. Even after this, if the survivor or the guardian refuses, kindly document their refusal, and this is called informed refusal. So this refusal, after knowing all the details, is called informed refusal, and it is to be documented. So if there is informed refusal by force, by use of reasonable force also, you can't examine a survivor. Then if you don't follow all these things, what happens? What is the result for a medical practitioner? Under Indian Penal Code, if it is an unintentional non-information of an NLC, it is punishable with 1 to 6 months of imprisonment along with fine. If it is an intentional failure to report an MLC, then it is rigorous imprisonment of 6 months with fine. Then if you furnish intentional false information, it is punished with imprisonment for 6 months and fine. Then if you are responsible for disappearance of evidence, that is when it is becoming too late because of your negligence or your carelessness, evidence could not be collected. Thereby, there is evidence like glass pieces or bullet are not perishable, but evidence which are dependent on like vomiters or blood are perishable evidences. If you don't collect this in time, and if it is intentional, then the punishment can go up to 7 years. And as a result, your registration can be suspended, or worst case scenario can be cancelled. Then you have latest development is the Law Commission report that happened in 2020. So there is talks going on for medical treatment after accidents and during Emergency Medical Condition Act. Though you have CEA, that is Clinical Establishment Acts, and more particularly Tamil Nadu Clinical Establishment Acts, both say that saving life is priority. So for all pregnancy cases and accident cases, save and stabilize the patient, and then even if you don't have the facilities to take care of that particular patient, referring to another hospital will happen only after you give first aid. So that is already in place under CEA and TNCA, but a more exclusive act is on the way. Then refusal to treat MLC without justifiable reasons is an offense. What will be your justifiable reasons? Non-availability of resources or equipments is one of the justifiable reasons. Apart from this, there is no justifiable reasons. Then they have also proposed a law for compulsion of treatment. If it comes, IMA will be on top of everybody. So let's wait and see what happens. Then mostly what happens is when you deal with all these types of cases, and with 2013 amendment also to give free treatment for acid attack and rape victims. So who is going to reimburse our costs, hospital costs? So they are proposing for a scheme for the state governments to reimburse expenses. So then we see some cases where medical MLC, medical legal cases, reports have favored judgments and have influenced judgments, and because of such non-compliances, what has actually happened? This is a traffic accident against two individuals. So what happened is the doctor who treated the particular patient, neither in his chief examination or cross-examination, said that it was a medical legal case and referred it to a police. So it was a MCOP case, which is motor accident claims case, but the particular victim was not able to claim anything because it was not a not the doctor didn't do his duty properly. So the court said the doctor may be working in a government hospital or in a private hospital, but he has a duty to record details of the patient involved in a medical legal case in a designated register and report the same to the police. So then you have a factory accident case where a particular person was working in a factory, sustained injuries, and was taken to a hospital because the MLC was incomplete and there was no eyewitness in the hospital. Relief could not be granted owing to lack of evidence. You might have seen a lot of cases, criminal cases, where people who were held responsible in magistrate courts being acquitted in high courts and supreme courts for lack of evidence. The same way, if an MLC is not proper and incomplete, even relief under MCOP cannot be granted to an individual. Then you have a particular case where it was suspected as suicide, but because medical reports were very shabby, they ordered for a computer printout, and it was quite embarrassing for the hospital. Then you have burn injuries, a particular case where medical legal report, it was mentioned as 9:30 p.m. It was only a mistake. For 9:30 a.m. it was written as 9:30 p.m. So what happened is the assailant claimed that because it is written as 9:30 p.m. I was not present at this point of time with this person. I was available elsewhere, and that is the appropriate time of the incident. So even a simple mistake of noting down AM as PM can lead to a lot of confusion, and further records were all analyzed and found out that it was a simple mistake. Though it is a typo, it leads to lot of confusion. It was not an intentional mistake on part of the doctor. Then you have a criminal case where this is a firearm case where the prosecution had brought in a case stating that a person has has uh, shot two people with a single gun in a single shot. So they were standing horizontally, like you see in movies or whatever games or cartoons. The two people stand with one bullet, they kill two people. So this can happen in real life, but not in reality, because the ballistic expert that was called in and the medical expert who called it, they both verified that their stance that one injury was for a person standing horizontally, the other one was uh, for a person vertically, and the other one was for horizontal. So, based on medical evidence coupled with ballistic experts' evidence, it was found out that two firearms were used, and an innocent man was not going to jail that day. Then you have important case where it was a protect case. This case is of Justice Loya. It created a lot of ruckus and a lot of media attention was there, but a case was filed against the one of the issues against the hospital was that postmortem was not advised, but positive. Fortunately, the doctor in his progress notes has already mentioned that a postmortem is advised because we suspect some foul play. So that was the only indication, and the hospital has escaped a lot of media attention because the doctor has appropriately noted in his progress notes. And the hospital in time has also reported this to the nearby police station. So they were safe. So to conclude, healthcare professional plays two roles. One is they provide medical treatment and psychological support. Next is they assist in such proceedings because a lot of law and medicine are overlapped in MLC cases. They, as doctors, they collect evidence and document their findings, which is used by a judge to punish or to give relief. And doctors may feel that it is too much for them. The very case which stated that even private practitioners are responsible to handle MSc cases said this. The court said that members of legal profession, law courts, and everyone concerned should keep in mind that a person in medical profession should not be unnecessarily harassed for the purpose of interrogation or any formality and should not be dragged into investigations at the police station, and this is to be avoided as far as possible. The court also made sure that this is sent to all police stations and advertised by media. Then Doordarshan was famous. They advertised in Doordarshan also, and this judgment was passed to all police stations. Though it happened in one corner of India, this is gone to all police stations, and every police will know that they are not supposed to harass doctors for interrogations or for any legal formalities. Law courts, even for expert evidence, this particular bench of the Supreme Court said that law courts will not summon medical professionals and to give evidence unless the evidence is necessary, and an attempt will be made to not make the person wait and waste their time unnecessarily. So instead of a doctor sitting in a court for 9 to 5, he can just come, give his expert evidence and leave. The arrangement is to be made by the appropriate magistrate under this Supreme Court verdict. So with this, I conclude. Though there are repercussions if you don't record MLCs at appropriate timing, the court is not so heartless, and they understand that a doctor's primary duty is to save life and their time is not to be wasted. So the same is respected from doctors, not to evade giving medical expert evidence at times when they are called for. With this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Divya.
Yes.
That was a very detailed session on our medical legal aspects. No, I know most of us are usually ignorant on the legal aspects. I think this will shed a light to all of us. This will be soon uploaded, so I am hoping that whoever's missed out, please refer to these things, because as we know, the law has been modified now and then. We need to be updated on these kind of things, and we know we stay in a very protected environment. This might not be the situation when we go out into a smaller setting, smaller mission hospitals, other places where we might not be protected by or have a legal backup in our settings. So please take an earnest effort to be updated on your legal aspects. I think there are some chats put up. I would like to just go through it. There are some comments and as well as questions. Please feel free further to drop in questions now also. There was one comment saying, any update on Vinod Khanna's case judgment with regards to appeal in the Supreme Court?
So as far as I know, this Vinod Khanna judgment, there is a stay in the Supreme Court. This basically case was regarding pre-printed and pre-filled consent forms, which were very general in nature. So the Consumer Court had filed Consumer Court had given a judgment stating that the generic consent forms should not be accepted for specific procedures. Specific consent forms should be there. So as of the latest update that I could get, because of COVID, the courts and all are also not functioning as properly. So in November or December, I think there was a stay by Supreme Court on that order. So till the final judgment, stay means till the final judgment comes, that National Consumer Court's order is not in force right now till the final judgment comes in. We don't have to follow that judgment of National Commission, which said that pre-printed forms are unfair trade practices. That is what they were called in the judgment.
As of now, it's legal, is what they say.
Yeah, it's proper to continue until a judgment to the contrary comes.
Thanks.
For firearm cases, bullets need to be retrieved with rubber tip forceps. That is the procedure followed. If you have any further detailed doubts also, you can refer to, you can ask from our forensic science department. They are very helpful, and they have also conducted recent lectures on forensic science that is necessary.
One of the person who commented is also from the Department of Forensics, mentioning the thing, saying for a firearm case, bullets need to be retrieved, mentioned either with a clean gloved hands or a rubber tip forceps to avoid artifacts. Then there was a question prior to
child sexual abuse. Yeah, there are policies, institutional protocols available on the intranet. So if you in the intranet, I will just share the link. There it's available. There are proper flowcharts that has been made. So in intranet, there's a section of services. On services, there is a forensic medicine section, which contains all the flowcharts for management of child sexual abuse survivor, informed consent for forensic and medical examination of a child sexual abuse survivor, examination form for a survivor, forensic and medical sampling, checklist for medical management, and management of children under POCSO Act. So all of this is available in the intranet under the tab services.
Is it? There was a question further.
The patient is brought dead to the hospital. In CMC, the procedure is as soon as they enter dead, if you don't think there is any foul play, we don't even take in the patient inside. If the patient is brought in, presuming that there is some life, and you see that there is some suspicions, go for an MLC. If you see there is some marks or some injury, some biting mark, anything is there, go for an MLC.
And that means we'll issue the chart for the patient?
Yes. If you think it is suspicious, chart the patient and mark it as an MLC. And if you have any further doubts, when the case comes, as and when the case comes, kindly freely contact legal whenever you have all these doubts.
Sure. I think that answers. Any questions further or any comments from you, Mrs. Seema and Divya? Mrs. Divya? I think more and more questions might pop up later on also. Please feel free to mail to the legal office. I think they can reply to that also or can contact via medicine department. I think this will be an ongoing thing which we might face on a day-to-day basis. Hopefully things are going okay for from both ends. And as in it's fact that is a consumer thing evolved in the consumer product service product thing. And I think we have to keep up with our side of I mean we have to be obliged to be dutiful, but at the same time our honesty should be shown across to them. So that means we are very grateful to have the legal office working for us. Thanks again to Mrs. Seema and Mrs. Divya for taking out your time and then having this lecture for us. Thanks again to all the listeners. I think we'll wind up for today if no further questions.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.